Hi, everyone. This is a brief retrospection of the House of Secrets number 92. Now, I've just been getting back into comics recently, and as a teenager, I was really into the gritty world of Vertigo comics, mostly Sandman, Hellblazer, but of course, I also liked Alan Moore's Swamp Thing run. I've read this issue before. I've read volume one of Swamp Thing. I've read the first part of volume two of Swamp Thing before Alan Moore started, but I kind of wanted to do a reread of this corner of the DC universe that I love so much. So here I am starting with House of Secrets 92, and it really is a great story. It's only 8 pages. Now, if you ignore the situation of swamp creatures in comics and how they're essentially all either copied from each other or derived from each other, this issue is really good. It came out in July 1971, and slightly just before this came out, either a few months or a year before, we had the first appearance of Man Thing in Savage Tales number 1. And after reading House of Secrets 92 and Savage Tales 1, oh man, the origin stories are shockingly the same. And of course, both of these characters are derived from earlier swamp creatures, so I think a lot of people theorized that that's why Marvel and DC didn't sue each other. Anyway, the cover, of course, is iconic, and we see the first design of Swamp Thing in the background. Of course, he has the same ridge on his nose, although it looks a little different. He looks more like the Lorax. And we get his wife, who looks shockingly like Linda Holland, but actually she's Linda Olson, and Swamp Thing is Alex Olson. So after good old Cain and Abel introduce us to the issue, we see a really worn out, depressed looking Swamp Thing wandering the forest near his home. His eyes are kind of sunken in, and we do have this really good monologue, internal monologue, which continues to be a core component of good Swamp Thing books. And we see this monster looking out onto his mansion, his former mansion. He thinks, I have stood watching that old gray edifice for more lonely nights than I want to recall, dreaming endlessly of the soft golden lady who lives within, knowing I can never have her, wondering what she's doing now. And within we see Linda and a gentleman called Damian Ridge. And these two are married, but Linda used to be married to Alex Olson. And so she's sitting here thinking of her fond memories with Alex. And Damien's basically telling her to just forget about him. So within Linda's memories, we see that Alex and Damien used to be lab partners. At some point, Linda gives Alex a golden bracelet that he puts on his wrist. This comes up later at the end, and we see that Damien essentially kills Alex in some kind of explosion in their laboratory, and then he hides his body. He buries his body in the swamp. And just something you don't see much anymore in comics is I talked about the monologue of Swamp Thing, but we also get segments where Damien is thinking to himself, where Linda is thinking to herself. I just think it's kind of unique. And in case you didn't know, I should say that apparently the character of Linda here, her appearance is based on Louise Simonson. For reference, Bernie Wrightson used her as a reference, and he used Michael Kaluta as reference for Damien. There's actually a set of pictures where they're in this kind of, I don't know, early 20th century garb or maybe late 19th century. So then later in the story, we see Damien is thinking to himself, I was every bit the bereaved friend at the funeral, always the comforting shoulder, the tender word. It was only a matter of time until you turned to me for comfort. Our marriage was inevitable. And Linda's showing like no interest in him. I don't really know why they married in the first place. I think obviously Damien just pressured her into it. And Linda thinks to herself. You walk quietly down the corridor to the shelter of your room, and you can feel Damien's gaze following you, searing tremors into the small of your back. Then Damien thinks, she can't bear my touch anymore. That's the first sign. All the little scraps of information she's been gathering are coming together at last. It's only a matter of time before she realizes that I killed Alex, and that will mean my end. However much I care for Linda, my own neck comes first. Linda must die. And we see Swamp Thing is watching all of this happen from outside. Linda says she feels watched. And it's interesting because, yes, she's being watched by Swamp Thing, but is that really what she's wondering about? She's facing two monsters in this story. So Damien approaches her and tries to inject her with something that I suppose would kill her. And then crash! Swamp Thing enters the room. The creature thinks, with a speed I've never known before, I move the fetid bulk that is my body across the span of feet, and the claw that is my hand closes upon Damien's wrist, crushing it. Slowly, certainly, I force the life from Damien's black-hearted body, a life he does not deserve. For several short minutes, Damien Ridge struggles for his unworthy life, tearing, clawing, ripping decaying shreds from what once had been my flesh, until, at last, he lies still forever. And my bright golden lady stands screaming behind me. And this last page is just my favorite. The loathsome monstrosity turns from the body of your husband and reaches for you, with arms dripping filth. Fear wells up within you like a flood, and the sound of your own screaming rings in your ears. I stretch out my arms to her, to calm her, to comfort her. I open my mouth to tell her how much I care, but what once had been my vocal cords have been silent too long. I cannot make a sound. The tortured, shattered look in her once sparkling eyes is more than I can endure. I turn my face away from her, and I start to go home. Only the swamp is kind to me now. It is only the swamp that cares. I look down at my wrist, at the barren place where once there was a golden bracelet, and I wonder where it is. If tears could come, they would. I think what we see here is actually a lot more in tune with later renditions of Swamp Thing than people think. Like, yes, in a lot of ways, this is a bare bones story, but it also has a feeling like nothing else. And like in what comes later, we have the swamp creature wondering about his own humanity. He's not sure if he's still Alex, just how the next Swamp Thing isn't sure that he's still Alec. And what we don't have, of course, is the more like metaphysical elements. We don't have the green, of course. But it actually stands in a lot of contrast with the first volume of Swamp Thing. Of course, the creature design is totally different, but, and I will make another video about this, in volume 1 of Swamp Thing, the creature is kind of goofy. He is, for the most part, he's traveling around the world, really, taking on new adventures, fighting a lot of villains of the issue. Hell, it almost reminds me of the older Hulk comics where he's just like going around fighting other big dudes, fighting animals, creatures, you know. Volume 1 Swamp Thing, like, he's a pretty physical guy. But there's also some of this, but there's also a horror side to it as well that creeps its head in really interesting ways. Anyway, again, I'll make another video about Swamp Thing Volume 1. But with this issue, I'm really impressed. I turn back to it every few years. This is probably the 4th or 5th time I've read it. And the influence it had is incredible. And it shows that Len Wein was capable of doing both of these horror stories and the kind of goofy adventures Swamp Thing gets up to later. And Wrightson's illustration is just fantastic, as all of his work is. Anyway, let me know what you think. Give me a follow if you are interested in experiencing my return to comics with me. I'm going to get through all the Swamp Thing. I'm gonna get through all the Vertigo comics, basically. Doing a really slow read of Swamp Thing Volume 1 right now. And I wanna work through all of Swamp Thing, and then I wanna work through all of Hellblazer, and I wanna work through all of Sandman, and eventually like Lucifer, and then like Justice League Dark. A lot of this I've read already, but it's another thing to do a really detail oriented, chronological deep read.